Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. First and foremost, I'd like to thank you, Mrs. Michal Herzog. I'd like to thank all of you for placing this important topic at the top of this conference's agenda. It is a great privilege for us to speak out and cry out this terrible cry of the men and women who suffered such terrible violence but cannot speak in their own voice because they have been murdered, massacred, and burned. And with your permission, I'd like to move on to the issue because the most impossible question nowadays is, how are you? So, of course, we're not going to talk about all the terrible testimonies, but we can say that one can see very, very clearly that this is an intentional strategy. We've seen the same pattern time and again in different arenas, and the sadistic violence and the necrophilic tendencies appear time and again, not by coincidence, and the world remains silent. First of all, hello everyone, and thank you for inviting me. Just like Jonathan said, this place, the Reichman University, is very dear to my heart, has been for many years. And I feel that whenever I come to the campus, another building was born. So thank you, Daniel, for this beautiful building. And thank you, Miri. And I wish you the best of luck as the new TV channel goes on air. It adds another facet to Israeli media. So thank you so much. Yes, we are living now in some very difficult times. Let's say that when my husband was elected as president, we never expected that this is what his term of office would look like. We started by swearing in when we still had the COVID discussions, and this is a good opportunity to wish best of health to Professor Reichman. And then we continued with some very difficult months after the recent elections. We tend to talk about October 7th and its aftermath, but sometimes we forget or perhaps repress everything that occurred here in the months leading up to October 7th, and then we reached the horrors of October 7th. And with all the chaos of these first days, it took me a few days as well to understand exactly what had happened on October 7th with respect to the planned, premeditated sexual violence that was adopted as a strategy in several locations. And once I understood that, I decided to take this as an important theme, an important topic, because this is a topic that Hamas has no answer for, because we all see how in the media and the social media platforms, let's say that we're not doing a very good job. But when it comes to this topic, it's consensus, and this is why it's so important for us as well as Israelis to continue and make sure that it remains on the world stage. Because this is a subject that Hamas has no answer for, because when people say to the world, when I say rape should not be a tool of war, sexual violence is not a weapon of war, period, well, there's consensus regarding that, and we should really make sure that this subject, people won't forget about it, especially in view of how, at the beginning, how the international organizations ignored this topic. Well, with your permission, I'd like to talk about how they ignored it. It took 50 days for the UN to issue a denouncement. One sentence: world leaders, we will never forget their denial. And even afterwards, the denominations were very, very weak. And after I was offended as a Jew and as an Israeli and as a woman, what happened to this solidarity between women, the I believe you? How can an Israeli woman today deal with this hypocrisy of the women's organizations in the world and the world in general? And well, I'd like to make a distinction between leaders and international organizations. From the leaders, we did see denouncements. We saw a series of leaders who came here immediately at the beginning of the war, both male and female leaders, Ursula von der Leyen, Annelina Brubeck, who's here today, the German foreign minister. We definitely did hear that voice, but the blind eye, those who ignored us were mainly the international organizations. Amos talked about the importance of Jordan, and I agree, if I may, not as a strategist, but regretfully, the person who heads the UN's women organization, there's a Jordanian woman, her name is Sima Barhus, and from the get-go, and that has been her line, this is her line until now, she has simply ignored this matter. And Israeli women who are experts in international law, people like Professor Ruth Halpern Kadari and Ifat Beaton, and I'm truly so proud of them. They fought in order to make their voice, to make the voice of these women heard. These women who can no longer have their voice heard because they've been murdered, and they made every effort to make that voice heard. And for the first time after the war, when I met Professor Ruth Halperin Kadari, and she's a very serious woman, you know, usually she's very calm and collected, but she was almost in tears from how her friends, how peers in the CEDAW UN committee, the committee that addresses women's rights in the UN, she was a member of that committee for 12 years. She was deputy chair, and how they ignored this topic, it was unbearable for her, and we continue to talk about it. And like I said, we continue to maintain this as a topic, and there has been a certain shift, especially after the report of Mrs. Pramila Patten, the Undersecretary General of the UN. She came to Israel. We hosted her at the President's residence. We invited 13 organizations that focus on women's rights and sexual violence since October 7th. We invited them to meet her, and still her report, which indeed mentioned it, and regretfully I maintain personal contact with them regularly, and I spoke with her just 2 days ago. She now is under such an attack, personally, a personal attack, because she has moral clarity. And now she is the target of so much hatred because of the truth that she spoke. And you talk about this topic in a lot of fora, and among other things you use, I've noticed the strategy of warning from the escalation in the next war in using sexual violence.
I can't help but think, is this the only thing that works? Because when Jewish women are victims to such horrific violence, it simply doesn't interest people, and it only starts to interest them when there's a potential warning involved that it may touch on their lives. I don't want to talk about this only as a demonstration of anti-Semitism. I would prefer to look at there's no positive side, but the activist, proactive side of things. Because, for example, when I'm invited to speak in the Security Committee in Munich, in a panel hosted by a woman, and there's a person there that 10 years ago dealt with the Nigerian women that were kidnapped by the Boko Haram organization, then yes, you do want to talk about it and make it universal, this violence against women. And I think that's the right way to do it, to make it and maintain it as what it is, a universal issue. And I'm saying it's not only the voice of Israeli women. What happened on October 7, and all of the experts in the world are saying this, that was above and beyond. The acts of brutality, first on the 7th of October, the rapes, sadly also rapes of women, even after they were murdered. I mean, this is such extreme manifestation of violence in conflict, and specifically violence, sexual violence against women. And we know the world is very turbulent. There will be more conflicts ahead. And I think it's our role as women to prevent the use of sexual violence in the next conflict, because they may make it even more extreme yet again. And that's something that I'd like to do, and that's also part of the message that really connect women everywhere in the world. And it's very important to you. I mean, I wish they talked about our specific subject here the way they talk about the Nazidic women in Boko Haram. But we saw something very concerning, a phenomenon, maybe it's not a phenomenon, but an event of a 12-year-old child, a girl in France that was raped, anti-Semitic rape. Even the term is unspeakable. Do you think women all around the world should be concerned? The waves of anti-Semitism worldwide are on the rise, and we must combat this. There is no doubt that that case is just inconceivably horrific, and I remind you that there are now young women that are still being held hostage in Gaza. Men and women, 120 hostages. I agree fully that they must come home. We will never be complete until they come home. And I know that we will hear later on from Mirav Leshem Bonen. And one of the really most difficult things since the beginning of the war, and we meet a lot of bereaved families and families of injured people and families that were evacuated from the north and from the south from their homes. And these are very emotional meetings, but the most emotional and profound are the ones with the families of the hostages. And the connection that I was making, I can say about Mirav personally. I met Mirav for the first time on a Wednesday, on that same, the Wednesday immediately after that horrific Saturday. That was the first initial meeting with families of the handicapped in the President's house. Since then, of course, the contact has become sadly a lot more personal, because so much time has elapsed, and when we know people and talk to them, you get connected to them. And then I met grandmother Dvorah, who's Romi's grandmother and Mirav's mother, and I met her sisters, and I met the family, and an amazing family. And you meet these amazing women in this family, such powerful women, and we need these young women. And I'm going to say something that I really find unsettling. At the end of the day, the transaction, the deal that may be happening or isn't happening or should be happening, certainly at least its first stage, its first round, is supposed to bring those first young women that are now in hell, to bring them home. But I can't see around the decision-making tables, around the negotiation tables, even one woman, even one mother. And I'm not an expert on strategy, I'm not an expert on negotiation, but I don't understand the logic of it. It seems irrational that the female voice, thinking a bit differently than men, yes, that women's voices are not in the room, not taken into consideration. So I would very much like to hear our voices, women's voices in the decision-making room around the table. I think that's very, very important. That's an enormously important point. Thank you. Thank you for stating that. And I wish there will be more women who are decision makers in the upper echelons. But next, I want to ask you, the Polish movie about Elia Cohen is going to be shown today. I don't know if you've already seen it. I know that at the moment we're just about to see or not see it. Everybody can decide. What do you think of this decision about the specific film? I think that, and I maybe quote Rachel Pauline Goldberg, that again, as I said about Mirav, these are women that had a completely private life until October 7th. They were just people living their lives. And now meet Rachel, Hirsch's mother, who's an amazing woman. She's a protector of her son, standing on every stage in the world and screaming out, but doing so with intelligence and force. And if she decided, because up until recently Rachel herself didn't want to see the video, and she said yesterday in the United States, she was talking about the ignorance of the Americans as well, that they don't understand here 8 hostages are US citizens. And it has to be a concern of the entire world. And this decision to publish the video, the film, is a very powerful one. Like Joe and Elohim, the decision of making the movie, The Screams Before Silence, that we'll see a little bit of it soon, led by Sheryl Sandberg. Every such tool is important. Every such means of making the voices of women heard, those hostages, and bring them home. Amen. It's unsurprising that we end this with a kind of a bit teary-eyed, but yes, thank you so much for all you've done. Thank you, and thank you all.